All right, I'll go ahead and get started. It's 9:30. This is my starting time for the women. I'm going to start us in prayer, and then we'll start talking about Gladys Aylward. I don't know if you guys have heard about her before, but her story was inspiring to me. All right, dear Lord, thank you so much for letting us gather here this Sunday morning, and just for just giving us the desire to learn more about women that have served you, Lord. I pray that the story today the story of Gladys will inspire and encourage us to just live our lives just more fully for you, and with you at the front of our minds, Lord. Lord, thank you for her example, and just thank you for how much her life served you. Thank you that you are a God that's willing, or that is worthy of being served by us with our whole lives, Lord. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Alrighty, so today we're talking about Gladys Aylward, and she's from London. Apparently, I like the English people because that's who I've been talking about recently. But has anybody heard of Gladys Aylward? So I think I hadn't heard about her, but as I read more about her, apparently at one point she was one of the most popular missionaries. But I only heard about her a year or two ago for the first time when I got this book. But anyway, Gladys Aylward is a missionary from London that I want to talk about today. Her story particularly drew me in, not because so much what she did, but because of she's kind of a very, you would think, insignificant person, given her qualifications and who she was, but just everything that God did through her life, and then just the story of her life, like just where God like intervened at every moment. I mean, she's one person where I read about her and I think, wow, you can totally see where God, like his providence in each interaction of her life. It was her it's really, really cool. I think missionary stories are very inspiring. But anyway, Gladys Aylward, she was born in London in 1902. Her early life, she dropped out of school at age 14, then went to work at a penny bazaar, which is kind of like a Dollar Tree of today's day and age. Eventually, she went into service. I think she worked in a restaurant and whatever. She made her way up to being a housemaid, but she really didn't make a whole lot of money. And her desire was to one day be an actress. She wanted to act. So she even took drama classes at night. And she writes in her book that one day she said, for a reason I don't know, I decided to go to a religious meeting. And she had grown up, as a Christian in a Christian household, it seems, but wasn't a believer. It was kind of similar to Susie Spurgeon. So she went to this religious meeting one night, and she said that's where she became a believer. And she read a little magazine about the millions of people in China who didn't know Jesus, and it just struck her. And she thought, from then on, she felt like she had a call to go to China. She felt like she had this heart to go to China. Um, but she thought it was everybody else's call. So she tried to convince her friends, like, you need to go to China. And, even tried to convince her brother, you need to go to China. And he basically was like, no, he said something like, that's an old maid's job, or why don't you go? And it never hit her, like, it never clicked with her, why don't I go? She that was just her little story, where she was just a high school dropout who worked at a Dollar Tree, and then basically went to be a housemaid, and got saved at a religious meeting for a reason that she attended. She had no clue. That's similar to Charles Spurgeon. I don't know if not similar, but he just kind of was on his way to one church and stopped in at another church, and just had somebody, just hearing somebody just kind of that you wouldn't expect, was what caused him to be saved. Anyway, she decided to go to missionary school or candidate training with the China Inland Mission, and she actually failed out of school. They said, you can't, you failed out of Bible class, you're too old. She was about 27 years old at that time. She was, I think she went there for about 3 months, and she was basically heartbroken. She thought, that's the only way you could go back then. I mean, you couldn't. I mean, unless someone sponsored you and you went with a missions group, it was really difficult to go. And they said, well, there's still a way you can help. There's actually if you have China on your heart, there's an old missionary couple that has returned from China, and they need a housemaid. And she was like, all right. Like that's not really what I had in mind, but that sounds good. So she went to this couple's, and sorry, a little stink bug. she, that would have distracted me. I could not have seen the stink bug. Yeah, but anyway, she went to this couple. She went to live with this couple. I think they're called the Fishers, and she said that's where she really like it hit her. She said these people love Jesus, and like they have a very like just she was like just their faith is so implicit and just like they live with him every day and they trust him with daily decisions and that he's their friend. She had never seen anybody live like this, and I just see this whole just this her path to getting to China is just God preparing her to show her what it looks like. It's more than just reading about China and being like, I have a heart for China and going to China. So then he kind of revealed his relational aspect with her through these people, and they encouraged her to just. Their encouragement was just to keep praying and keep waiting. Like you don't know that God has closed the door. She worked with them for a little while, and then she went and worked at a port city in England as a rescue sister. She would go rescue girls that were with sailors and stuff, and she would put them. They would pay for their train rides back home, and that was really good work. And people thought that was great work for her, but she said that was just still not. She felt that call to go to China, and sometime around there, she got sick and she went home. And she decided, like, and she opened up her Bible and she said, if I'm going to go to China one day, I guess I should probably read this. So that kind of was funny to me, too. Like, that she had this she had this heart to go to China, but she still hadn't really read her Bible or really been learning about the Bible. So that was another way God kind of used, like, just revealed to her, like, you need to, like, have a relationship with me and you need to know God's word if you're going to go teach other people about me. So she began just reading and learning and really just digging into the word. And at that point, I noticed in her story was when she really started to hear from God through scripture. And like she would, from that point on, she would kind of make references to the way God spoke to her, but it was using scripture, which I thought was really neat and really encouraging. Anyway, so when she stopped working as a rescue sister, she decided I'm just going to pay my own way to go to China. And she decided to go back to London, and she worked for a wealthy couple and basically just worked her tail off until she could pay enough money to go to China herself. She would go down to the shipping market, and she tried to get a ship passage to China. They basically laughed at her and said that you're never going to make it. And so she said it was like 90 pounds or something, some crazy amount of money that was way too much for her back then. And the guy said, well, there is another way. You could take a train, from here through Russia to China, but at the same time, there's a war going on in Russia or around that area. And she was like, oh, I'll be fine. By the time I save up enough money, it probably won't be a big deal anyway. So he let her put down some money towards that ticket at that point, and she came back every week with extra money. She would work nighttime jobs and serve at banquets and do whatever she could to earn enough money to send herself to China. She at some point is at another church and overheard someone saying that there was an elderly lady, an elderly Irish woman who had lived her life with her husband in China. He died. She came back, but she was not content back in England. She had said something like, I'd rather die with the Chinese than to spend the rest of my life knitting in England. So this widow went back to China and had been praying that a young lady would come join her. And so that's when Gladys said, that's me. So that became her point. That became kind of her contact point. And she thought, well, she started writing to her, as soon as I make up enough money to go to China, I'm going to go stay with Miss Lawson. That lady's name was Miss Lawson. She finally earned enough money to buy this crazy train ticket from England to China. And she left on Saturday, October 15th, 1932. She was born in 1902, so she was 30 years old. She had only enough money to buy a one-way ticket. There were no furloughs really back then. Her parents helped her get ready. I just can't even imagine She said it was such a blessing that they didn't try to stop her from going, but they literally were putting on this little. She was 4 foot 10 inches tall, and and had she just had the suitcase in her hand that just donated supplies. Someone donated a fur coat, which she says later would save her life. Um, just a little bit of food, enough to get there, and a stove to cook her food. And her mom had sewn little pockets into all of her little jackets for her to hide everything and carry stuff. And they literally just put her on this train to go meet this woman she's never met in China, and to go travel through a war zone. And the war zone did affect her trip. So she left on Saturday, October 15th, 1932. They didn't know this at the time, but she wouldn't return for 17 years. And that's a long time. When she did return, they didn't even recognize her because she'd gone through so much. I mean, she was older and she'd just gone through a lot. So anyway, as she's going on the train, she meets this couple that is going back somewhere in Europe, and they had just left these things called Keswick meetings, and they got talking to her, and found out she was a missionary, and so they said, well, we're going to pray for you every night at 9 p.m. And so when they got off there, for the rest of our lives. So she thought that was encouraging, and the husband kind of gave her a hug as he left his stop, and when she left, when they walked off, she realized he'd given her a English £1 note in her hand. She thought, well, that's kind of strange because I'm going to China and I won't really be able to use it, but she just kind of tucked it in one of her little pockets that her mom gave her. She kept going, and she finally gets over into Russia. And she said when she got over into Russia, it was like a different world. It was freezing cold. I mean, she couldn't understand anything anybody spoke. And as she got further and further towards this one destination, she realized that more grandmothers and like young people were getting off, and more soldiers were getting onto the train. She thought, and eventually, till she was the only person on the train with a bunch of Russian soldiers. And she said they were not like the British soldiers; they were very rough and kind of gruff, and she was just sitting there. She said they were like just chewing on their food, and it was going everywhere, and they're spitting and wiping their snot everywhere. And she was just, okay. Well, she gets to her this Chita, this place called Chita. And the train guy, the whatever engineer, conductor, tries to get her to get off, and he can't speak to her. She can't speak to him. They're motioning at each other, and he's la, 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 and she's going, nope, I'm not getting off. She's la, 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 and he's like, get off, get your stuff off, off, off. And she's like, nope, because she said, in my mind, I thought every mile down that train track is 1 mile closer to China. Well, he finally just threw his hands up and said, fine, whatever. So she just left. She leaves. She gets her passport stamped. She's going on in freezing cold in Russia, snow. The only way they could get through is because the snow had been cut out through the tracks. I don't know. They go so far, and finally the train stops, and they hear shooting and guns in the distance, and she finds out that they can't go anymore because there's a war down the track. And the soldiers get off and leave, and she's literally just stuck there on this train. It's getting dark. Eventually, they motioned to her, the conductor and a couple other guys motioned to her and tell her, you can't stay. Like we're basically going to stay here. And they told her, with our hands, it could be 10 days, 20 days, 30 days. We don't know until we fill this train up with injured soldiers and then head back. And they were like, they pointed to her suitcase, pointed back up the tracks and said, go. And it was freezing cold. I've been reading this, okay. And this winter, every time I'm out in the cold for more than a minute and I'm cold and I want to go back inside, I think Gladys Aylward was out in that freezing cold. She walked 30 hours back to that train station. And by herself. Nobody went with her. Nobody cared. Nowadays, somebody would help you. She was running out of food. She said that's when that fur coat that a friend had given her saved her life. She literally just sat down and she said it was God, like just by the grace of God that she even survived the cold. Just by the physical laws, she should have frozen to death. That's how cold it was. She said she heard dogs in the background, and she thought, well, who in the world let their dogs out? She said years later she didn't realize that those were wolves, and it was like literally God's grace that he let her not realize that those were wolves, because she was allowed. It gave her kind of peaceful sleep that night before she woke up I can't even imagine. I just can't even imagine being 30 years old, not even 5 feet tall, sleeping in the middle of Russia, in snow, walking back somewhere where they still won't be able to talk to her, and her train ticket is the other way. I mean, she's that just seemed I can't even imagine. I would just want to go back. To me, that would be like, well, that's God telling me I shouldn't do this, and I'd head back to England. But that's not what Gladys did. She finally makes it back. She has quite an ordeal. They're trying to they read her passport and they try to change it. They end up changing it and making it say machinist and instead of missionary, and say that we need people like you here to work machines for the war. She's like, no, I'm a missionary. I'm not a machinist. I don't know how to work that. And it was really, apparently it was like a very scary ordeal when she got back there, because they were taking her passport. They stole most of her things. They emptied her suitcase. She still had that little 1 pound note though that was stuck. They like took everything out of her pockets. They didn't find this one little pocket, and that would come in handy in a little bit. Finally, a picture of her brother. Her brother was a British soldier, and he played the band. He came out. It fell out of her Bible or something, or a notebook, and they picked him up. They picked up the picture and thought, this looks like an important guy. So that's when they stopped. They left her alone. They thought, you must be important because you know this important guy. And so somehow they helped her go another way, because she couldn't go on that train to where she was going. So when she gets on the train, that's when she realizes they took everything from her. And this is still just the trip to China. I mean, I was reading about this thinking, how in the world? I mean, I would die if one of my daughters went through this, or if I went through this. I can't even believe that she was so determined to get there that she did this. But anyway, she's going somewhere, and as she's going, she thinks, is this place really going to get me to China? Like, so she's at another train station where the trains are passing, and I know this is kind of one big crazy story, but she's going to where they told her to go, but she just said, I'm just going to yell out at a train passing and say, can I get to China? Or I forget what she says. And and this guy just happens to speak English and says, no, there's no trains leaving where you're going. Go to Vladivostok. And so she said, how crazy is it that one train passing that I happened to yell out, and that person understood what I said, knew what was happening, where I was going, and knew that they weren't leaving, and that I would be stuck there in the middle of a war zone, and told me to go to Vladivostok. So she changed her ticket to Vladivostok, but she ends up getting there, and she gets caught up with this. She goes to a hotel where this guy can speak English. So I know this is crazy. She's just going from place to place to place, and he takes her passport. He tries to like force his way into her room one night. It's very crazy. And the night that he tries to force himself into her room, she said, I mean, she's very stubborn, and she's forward. She was like, no. God has placed a barrier between you and me, and you will not come in here. She said he just went and just left. He hadn't, because he said he was trying to come in. He said, I'm the master of this place, and I can do with you whatever I want. And that's when she said no. And she apparently grabbed her passport from his hand and shut the door, and he left her alone. And while she was in Vladivostok at this hotel where that guy was, this random girl comes up to her and says, you need to leave. You're in trouble, and if you don't leave tonight, you won't make it. So she's like, should I trust this person? I don't know. She points out all these provisions that God made. The guy who spoke English on the passing train, this girl who tells her that she's in trouble, and the girl says, you'll hear a knock at your door tonight, and follow the old man, and he'll take you to where you need to go. So after what just happened to her, I really just can't even imagine. So she prayed. She was like, I don't know whether to trust them or not. And she felt like she should trust them. She hears the knock on the door. She follows this old man. He takes her to a Japanese ship, and she tries to get on, and basically, and then she meets the girl meets her on the way and says, get on that ship. Whatever you do, if you're not on that ship, you may be taken like as a prisoner of war or whatever. She had no money. The Japanese ship said, I can't take you. You have no way to you can't pay your passage. And the captain said, well, are you willing to become my prisoner? Because if I take you as my prisoner, then I can take you for free. So she had to trust that. And she said, okay, so she signed prison papers and became his prisoner. While all this, she was still outside the dock at the time, and the Russian soldiers realized she was trying to leave and started running for her to get her to not go on the boat. So she threw her suitcases onto the boat, and they were coming. And apparently, they grabbed her and were pulling at her, and she realized she had that 1 pound note, and she pulled it out, waved it in the air, and flung it up. And while they were trying to fling for it and grab it, she like took a running jump and jumped on the ship. And once she was on the ship, she was safe. And so I know this is so bizarre. And she finally makes the trip. And this is before she even gets to China. I mean, this could be deleted from her account, and her account would still be amazing. She gets on the ship. There's another girl there. Her hands are bandaged up, and she was like, "Well, what happened to you?" Something she had been trying to escape too, and they had tried to take this other girl's rings off her finger and like ripped her skin, and all her skin had just been ripped off. I mean, so the fact that Gladys made it onto the train relatively unharmed was amazing. When she gets over to Japan, the captain hands her over to the British consulate or whatever it was at the time, and the guy basically says, "You're a fool. You're the biggest fool I've ever met." But bought her a warm meal and gave her a place to stay, and helped change her tickets, and helped her get her way over to China. So finally, on November 10th, so she left on Saturday, October 15th. So imagine this whole time. On November 10th, she finally sets foot into the city of Tientsin, where she was going to meet Mrs. Lawson. She gets there. Mrs. Lawson was not there, but she had sent someone to meet her. So she finally is in China, and she gets here, and the guy says, "We're still 10 days away from where we need to go." So then she has 10 more days of crazy trots. So she rides a train, and then the train stops, and she has to ride a bus over mountains and like through rivers. She said this bus was the craziest vehicle she'd ever seen. It was the fact that it could go up these mountains and then rivers and travel. And then they get almost there, and then they get to the point where they can't go anymore by vehicle. They have to ride these mule trains. So they have these mules, like they call them mule litters, that you just have to ride a mule up and down these mountains. So she said she had to get on a mule and ride it for 2 days. This is all just to get there. She said when she finally got there, and her guide said, "We're here," she said, I fell off the mule. She was like, I was like, every bone in me hurt. And she's like, I finally got there, and Miss Lawson comes out and was like, well, hello, or something. And she was Irish, I can't remember, Irish or from Scotland. I can't remember. But she wasn't. They kind of had personality conflicts. Gladys was a little kinder, and Miss Lawson was a little more grumpy. But she just kind of was like, "Well, are you going to come in?" And but Gladys said it was kind of like as if your neighbor came and you were asking, "Well, are you going to come in?" And she's like, "Am I going to come in?" Yes, it's been 5.5 weeks from the time that she had stopped. So like all this that had happened, and then she also talks about the crazy hotels that they stayed in every night. They were basically just big main rooms where you slept in your clothes on the warm brick, and people had lice, and I mean it was not great living conditions. But anyway, she gets there, and that's when her work starts. So that, to me, I thought, I was reading this book, and I thought, that's how she got there? I would want to go back home. But she also began to eat rice on the Japanese boat. And she said, I found it was really hard for her to digest, and she could not handle the rice. Like her stomach, she couldn't swallow it, and it couldn't digest it. And she happens to go to a place in China where the rice is not their staple. They eat millet and noodles. So she was like, that was just another one of God's provision, that I couldn't eat rice. And he had already planned for me to go to a place in China where they actually didn't eat rice, which apparently was relatively, I don't know, it was rare, but a lot of places do eat rice. So that God just provided for her in that. So she gets there, and Miss Lawson had rented this big, huge building relatively cheap, but it was really torn down and nasty. And she's like, "Well, I'm glad you're here. Let's get to work." And nobody she could rent this big huge building because people and the locals thought that it was haunted by devils, and well, clearly Christians didn't think that it was haunted by devils, so they could rent it and and knew that it was going to be okay. The Mrs. Lawson had this dream of turning it into an inn. So the villages were all separated where they were. You know, she had to ride this mule train up there, and these muleteers were the ones who guided these mule trains, and they had to stay in villages at night in inns. So what would happen? So each village had a few inns, and they tried to get the muleteers to stay there overnight, and they would feed them and let their mules stay there. So Miss Lawson said, if we can open up an inn, I thought this was actually a pretty good idea, and it was relatively successful. We can get these muleteers in here, and we will teach them Bible stories, and hopefully they will become Christians, and then they will go and travel. Storytelling was really, really big. They loved to hear stories, so they actually claimed that they told these stories for free. So the muleteers eventually thought this was amazing that they would get to hear free stories. They didn't have to pay for them. So they would tell these stories to the muleteers, who would then take these stories to other places in the village. And I thought like that's a pretty good idea. And he used a housemaid from London to come over and help clean this place up and serve in this inn. Well, Miss Lawson was she could speak Chinese and the dialect of this area called Yangqin, and Gladys could not. That was one of the reasons she failed mission school, because they said you're not going to be able to learn the Chinese language. It's way too hard, especially at your age. So because Gladys couldn't speak Chinese, she was given the job of cleaning off the mules every night. So they got all their, yeah. And when they first opened, I thought this was funny. Because I just think about what I would think, or what really any girl would think. Miss Lawson said, "All right, my job's going to be to get them in here and once they're in here, to tell them stories. They hired a cook. He's going to cook and feed them. Gladys, what they did was when it was time at night for the muleteers to kind of settle in, they would stand out of their inn. Gladys said she felt like she was at a circus, and they would say, "Oh, we have no bugs. We have no fleas. Come, come, come. Good, good, good." And she said, I felt like I was calling people into a circus. "Come, we have no bugs. We have no fleas. Come, come, come. Good, good, good." And there was these two foreign devils, is what they called them. And the muleteers did not want to stay. And so Miss Lawson said, your job is going to be to grab the mule's head and to pull them in. Because once they started to come, all the mules would follow, and they couldn't, it was just no use. They just had to stay there that night. And Gladys was like, "You want me to grab the mule's head and pull them in?" And she said, "Are you serious?" She said, "Do they bite?" And Miss Lawson said, "Not if you grab them in the right place." So Gladys was like, "This is not what I had in mind when I came to China, but this is what God had in mind." So she laughed because she said the first mule that came that she grabbed and pulled it in, the muleteer was so scared that he ran off and left his mule there. They ended up grabbing some more mules that night, and when he saw the other guys would come in and were fine, he came back and got his mules. So anyway, Gladys says she would sit outside and wipe off the mules their feet and clean off the dirt from them. She would listen to Miss Lawson tell Bible stories in Chinese, and she would. That's how she learned. That's really how she learned Chinese, was just talking to. She began to talk to the muleteers. So she learned. She said she learned like the street language of Chinese, like talking to the muleteers and hearing the Bible stories. Um, so let's see. Okay, eventually Miss Lawson, that lasts for about a year. Miss Lawson, she was old, and she ended up dying about a year after Gladys got there. But God had let Gladys learn the language very quickly. She initially had some problems, but by the end of the year, she could carry on conversations. And so Miss Lawson was sick, and right as Miss Lawson, and they'd had some fights at one point. Like Gladys had to leave for a few days, and Miss Lawson could be really hateful sometimes. But Gladys said, even with all our disagreements and just personality conflicts, like we we both had the same goal, which was to share the gospel with all, like with the Chinese people who really did not know Jesus at all, and that like their hearts were just so broken for them, they were able to work together even through that. But Miss Lawson, right as she was about to die, said, "Gladys, God called you by my side in answer to my prayers. He wants you to carry on my work. He will provide. He will bless and protect." Um, and so Miss Lawson died. The thing when Miss Lawson died, what they also lost was her. She had a small income. I'm not really sure where it came from, but she had a small income that was helping them survive. They were only allowed to charge a certain amount per night for at the inn. So even with that, the cost of the rent of the inn and the cost of everything that they were doing was not enough to keep them afloat. Like she still needed more money, and so Gladys was willing to stay. I mean, she now is the only person that speaks English anywhere around that she sees on a regular basis. So she's like, I've just prayed that God would provide something. Well, around the same time, the ancient custom of foot binding. Have you guys ever seen the Chinese pictures of that? It had been outlawed a few years before, but they said, like a lot of laws, China was huge, and it was not making its, like the enforcement of this law was not making its way up into these villages. So there was the leader of their villages and this whole province with the different villages was called a mandarin, and he commanded a lot of respect. I mean, he could issue execution orders. I mean, you didn't mess with the mandarin. Well, one day he came to see Gladys after Miss Lawson died, and said, the new government that has taken over has said that it's my responsibility to enforce that all foot binding has ended in my district, all these little villages that were connected by the mule trains. And it is, men are not supposed to look at women's feet. I need a woman to look at women's feet. The problem with that was that all the women had their feet were bound. So they were basically crippled the rest of their life. They couldn't walk. They couldn't walk all over and do this. And so he said, "You have big feet." And she said, apparently she had size 3. And so, "You're big feet. You can walk around. And I need you to be my foot inspector. I need you to go to every single village and every single household in the entire district. Make sure they have unbound all the feet of children 12 and under, or girls 12 and under, and then keep going back to make sure that they have they continue to obey and don't rebind their feet." And he said, "I will give you 2 soldiers to make sure that you're safe, and I can't pay you a lot, but I can give you this such and such amount." And she basically, I mean, she said she couldn't believe the opportunity, and she said, "I will do this, but I came to China to preach the gospel and to share Jesus Christ with people that don't know him. And if I go into these houses, I will share the gospel with them when I go in there." And he thought about it, and he said, "Very well, that's fine. If they what is that to me? And even if they do become Christians, they won't bind their girls' feet, and so that will make it better for me because they'll obey the law." So she said, "I cannot believe this. I needed money. I prayed, and God gave me even more than I asked for." He said, "Not only am I going to give you money, I'm going to give you access to every single house in this entire village, and I'm going to give you government protection, and you've received permission, and you've said." No, she actually didn't even ask. She said, "I'm going to do this." And she's getting paid to preach the gospel in every single household in all these little villages. So she ends up doing this for a few years. And she becomes known as the storyteller. I mean, she tells Bible stories everywhere they go. She teaches them songs. People were coming to know Jesus. Like they were. I mean, a lot of Christians. A lot of people became Christians as a result of this. Which I thought, to me, when I read the story, I was like, "Well, that's it. That's your story. What an amazing thing. That's still just one thing." While she's doing this, she literally, one of the reasons they say that she was so successful is because she became like the Chinese. She told Elizabeth Elliot later in her life that one thing that always bothered her when she was little was that she didn't have curly little gold or golden curls like her friends, and that she stopped growing at 4'10". And I guess she said, but that was God's plan for me. God had already planned for her literally before she was born, to go to China because she had black hair and she was 4'10". So when she went to China and adopted there, she began to eat like them. She learned their language. She dressed like them, and she had brown eyes. And she looked. I mean, she looked very much like a little Chinese woman. And she, as opposed to like Miss Lawson, who had like bright blue eyes, and she was able to function too. But just that Gladys was able to literally become like the Chinese, and they trusted her so much. She actually became a naturalized Chinese citizen. She applied for that. She lost her British citizenship when she did this. I really don't know how all that works. But so in 1936, so she had been there about 6 years or so, I guess, or no, 4 years. I was thinking about from the date of the school. She became a naturalized Chinese citizen. She's like, these are my people. Like that. This is where I'm going to stay. They said that would have affected her later. Later there was a war that came out, and we'll talk about. And they would not, if she had asked for it, she didn't. But if she had asked for help in evacuating, they wouldn't have let her go because she was no longer a British citizen. So I mean, she gave up a lot of rights in becoming a naturalized Chinese citizen. So, this is just her living her life. She's still running the inn while she's going to do all these visits. Um, One day, she sees an old lady, and this old lady has a little girl with her that looks like she's almost about to die. And she says, she tells the lady, you need to get her out of the sun. She's about to die, and you need to take care of her. And the lady is basically like, it's none of your business. And this is Gladys. It is my business. I am the foot inspector of the Mandarin, and it is my business. Well, then the lady said, well, if you want her, you can have her for like $2. And Gladys was appalled. Like, you're selling children? So she went straight to the Mandarin and said, the same Mandarin who had, who had asked her to do the foot binding. He still had the same position. And she told him about this, and he basically said, it's not allowed, but this, basically a big group of criminals that we can't really stop is doing it, and you need to leave them alone, and that's an order. And apparently when he finished speaking, the custom was that like he gets the last word and you leave. And Gladys like walks out the door, and she looks at him and says, I didn't come to China to obey your laws. I came to China to obey Jesus and to share Jesus, and this is not right. And she left. And later on, the Mandarin said that was the beginning of their friendship. He's like, when she said that to me, he could have had her executed for that, but instead he said, like, his heart was warming to Gladys. He's like, that was when we became friends. Like, our friendship started. So she went back and basically buys this child. She didn't set out to do it, but she buys this child, and she says, I like to call it adopted. So she adopted this child and became her mom. She had been praying. She said, like before that, she was very lonely, and after Miss Lawson died, especially, and had been praying that God would send somebody to to help her with her work. She was also kind of at the same time praying that God would send her a man she was from a British man that would come. She later told Elizabeth Elliot, I believe that God did call somebody. He just didn't come. So she never got married, but she said that God's answer to her loneliness was this orphan who quickly turned into 20 orphans that she took in to the inn, because they would find things were happening in China, and that there were just a lot of orphans, and especially in their little villages. So she said by a few days or a few weeks, or she had almost 20 orphans. And she said, what is it that she said? She said, I couldn't complain of being lonely. Indeed, often I craved for a few moments of peace. I couldn't. So that made me laugh. On another one of her trips, to check and make sure that the people hadn't rebound the feet. She said she came to a town that was generally known to be not very friendly. So they got there in the evening, and the innkeeper was like, "Rah, don't, what? You can start your foot inspections in the morning." And she thought, no, because you're going to go out and try to get them to. You're going to tell everybody, and they're going to hide people, or they're going to unbind them temporarily or something. And so she went out that night, and one of the first houses she went to, it was dark, and she just felt like somebody was in there. So like they banged on the door, and this little old lady that was like, just kind of wasting away came out, and it was gruff and trying to get them to go away. And she kind of pushed her way in and forced this lady to say that there was somebody in there. And the lady brought out this little like 4-year-old girl, and her feet, she was crying, and her feet were bound. It was a really painful process. I mean, I mean, it was very, very painful for the girls. So Gladys like took her feet out and put them in warm water and unbound them and put them out. And she said like the girl started, was just happy and was excited. She felt like there were more people there and forced this lady to finally admit that there were more girls there. And I think they brought 4 more girls out. And she found out that this lady had been basically purchased by a master who had purchased these girls, and she was supposed to be binding their feet up so that he could sell them off. Because it was still one of the things that the Chinese women were afraid of were that they were not going to get husbands when their feet weren't bound, because they had been convinced for years that it was beautiful to have these teeny tiny little feet that were stuck, like they were like 4 inches long. They only looked cute when they were in little boots, not when you took out their off their boots. But and so some men still wanted women or girls to marry that had these feet. So I guess you could kind of buy them on the black market. Gladys ends up taking these girls back to her. She realizes like they're basically like little prisoners, so she takes them back to her inn and takes them in. But she takes that old woman too, and the old woman thought that she was taking her back to prison. They get back to the inn, back in her town of Yangqin, and I forget the exact conversation, but the lady basically thinks that she's going to prison, and Gladys says, I love these girls. God loves these girls, and God loves you too. And I mean, God even died for you. And somehow over that night, because of conversations that they had, the lady that night accepted Jesus and became a believer and became a big helper. They even ended up, apparently it was an ordeal, but they paid her price of her freedom from her master for this lady. And she ended up staying at the inn for a while and helping them out and helping with the girls. And so I thought that was that's just another awesome story that she literally just did whatever God put in front of her. Gladys just did. Another day, she gets word that they want her at the prison. They said, the Mandarin has called for you, and the prison governor is here. There's a riot out in the prison. Nobody can go in. The prisoners have machetes, and they're killing each other, and we need you to go in there and stop them. And she's like, me? Why would you want me? And they're like, you have a living God, and you said that your living God, will stop pain and suffering. And is that not true? And she thought, oh my gosh, my witness is at stake. If I say I can't do it, like they will never listen to me again, and I won't be able to share the gospel. Like she had been doing that for years. And so she goes in and to this prison. Apparently, she just goes in there and says something like, "I want you guys to stop right now," and and I want you to hand me that machete. And she said, literally, they all just stopped. I mean, it's going crazy. I mean, there's dead people. I mean, it's blood everywhere. She said the conditions are horrid. I mean, they were treated like subhumans. And she said the main guy that was flailing the machete around just looked at her and like just dropped his machete. And she was like, "You guys, I can't go out there and tell them what you guys are wanting. If you can't clean this place up, clean this place up." And they like start cleaning this place up. She said, "I have no clue why they listened to me that day, but they listened to me. They cleaned the place up." And she talked to them, and she was like, "What they says at one point she says, what were you doing when this started? And they said, what were we doing? Like, we don't do anything. We just sit here. She said, they don't have you do anything? And they said, no, I mean, they're starving. Like, people had to bring them food or they would starve. It was freezing cold. They didn't have any clothes. And she couldn't believe that they didn't have them do anything. They literally were just there for years. She was like, and she went out and told them, no wonder that they rioted. I mean, their conditions are deplorable. They don't have food. They're freezing. They're dying. They're sick. They've got wounds all over them. And they couldn't believe that Gladys got them to calm down. And she said, I have promised them that you would not punish them for this if they stopped. And they said, well, whatever. I can't believe you got this to stop, and we'll help out. And so they listened to her say, like, she said, why don't you get them looms and some materials and let them weave their own clothes? Why don't you bring in some seeds and let them, they apparently had some courtyards and stuff, and let them plant their own vegetables for food. And apparently that kind of, revamped this prison in their system, in their area. And that was one of her big things. A guy that wrote a biography about her later on, apparently he was talking to her later on in her life, trying to get her to tell stories about what had happened. And she basically said, I haven't done anything that's worth writing about. She would tell him stories, well, we evangelized here one time, and I evangelized here one time. And he was just writing down. He was like, is there, anything else? And apparently she said something about, one time we were delayed because of the prison. And he was like, the prison? What about the prison? And that's when the story came out. Like, well, there was this prison riot that broke out. And he thought, you didn't think to tell me that? Like, that wasn't like an interesting thing that happened? Like, that's just not normal for a little 5-foot tall woman to go in there and calm down, like, criminals. You think what happens to their brains when they've been in these conditions. I mean, they were going crazy. Anyway, so she stopped them. As apparently as she was leaving, one of them yelled out and said, thank you, Always Day. And that meant virtuous one. So that became her name. And that was even her official name when she became a citizen. Some of the timing gets confused. Later on she has some stuff happen to her, and she can't remember all the timings exactly well. But anyways, so then in 1938, war had already started, but it finally reached her little town of Yangqing. It was bombed in 1938. The inn was damaged. So over the next few years, they had to. It was kind of confusing, but depending on who was in control, whether it was the Chinese or the Japanese, they would either be able to come back to their town or they would have to flee into the mountains. And when they would flee, she actually knew, because she had traveled around, she knew the place so well that she knew of caves where hundreds of people could go in and seek refuge. And they would, and so she was able to help people that didn't normally travel all the way around, help them travel and find places to stay. So that was just another one of God's provisions for her, that because he had given her this job years before, she knew where to flee to help save lives. Well, it was bombed. And then at some point during the fighting, I thought this was a really neat story. A Chinese general came and asked her, basically wanted to put her under arrest. Thought she was spying. Said, "Who has told you about me?" And she's like, "I don't know what he said. Who has told you, sensitive information about my life?" And she said, "I don't know. I don't know I don't know anything about you other than what we all know, that you're a Chinese general." Well, apparently a couple of days before, or a few days before, she had, because of just the destruction that had happened in their town, she was kind of encouraging some people and preaching the gospel to some people in the city. And at one point she said, when we're all sinners, and she pointed over here to a group of women, she said, we're all sinners, something like that. And well, she didn't realize this, but the general had his hat off and had kind of snuck in to check on things, and was standing in the doorway. So he thought that she had pointed to him and said, we're all sinners. So that started laying on his heart, and he was and she thought, anyways, it was laying on his heart, like, what do you mean I'm a sinner? He started asking her questions. The general of the Chinese army that was there ended up becoming a Christian. And he said, well, now that I'm a Christian, I can't. We've been going to these places, even though we're Chinese, and we've been looting all the area and stealing and things like that. We can't do that anymore. So he got up and he told his men, we're not going to do this anymore. We're only going to do our orders. We're not going to steal from the towns. We're not going to do this. And so Gladys thought, well, that's awesome. So he goes on his way with his men. A couple years later, a beggar comes into their town, and he's basically kind of lost his mind. He keeps saying something over and over again. And one of the guys said, don't you remember him? And she's like, no, that's the general. And so she's like, what happened to him? And she, she ended up, they found out his story. After he left the town, when he became a Christian, his men turned against him, but they still wanted to use his influence. They basically like stripped him down, tied him up, and made him go with them everywhere, and like beat him. And I mean, they were just really mean to him. But he wouldn't. They wanted him to keep leading them in a way that they had been, that he had been leading them, and taking things from towns and being cruel. And he wouldn't do that. So they basically just like tortured him for months and months. Until he became a beggar. Well, he ended up coming back and living with them for a while. I think he ended up dying. There's so many of these stories that I couldn't even keep them all straight. I was like, oh my goodness. But just like that, even high-ranking people were willing to give up a lot to live their life for the God that Gladys was preaching. That's how strongly that she shared her faith. One time when they were in the caves, somebody came up to them, and she recognized him as one of the muleteers that had frequented their inn, and he basically was in shock, and he wouldn't talk. When he finally was able to talk, he said that the Japanese came to his town and wanted him, when they found out he was a muleteer, wanted him to load up all his mules with ammunition to carry, and he wouldn't do it. He said, I'm a Christian, and I'm not going to carry ammunition to kill other Chinese, to kill my brothers, or to kill anybody. A lot of the Christians wouldn't be involved in the fighting. They would help in other ways, like help with the sick and the wounded. And the Japanese, because he wouldn't do that, they took him and they tied him to a stick out in the right outside his house. And as he was telling the story, Gladys thought, oh, I bet that's what's happened. They've tortured you. They didn't. They tied him to a stick. Then they put all his family and his wife and children inside their house, boarded it up, and set it on fire because he was a Christian and would not help them. And he wouldn't turn, he wouldn't, like, as he was doing this, he still would not do what they said because he said, I can't, I'm a Christian. I mean, these are the kind of stories and the kind of things that she dealt with. She said, at some point, someone found out she was from Great Britain, and they said, why are you here when your country needs to hear about God too? And she's like, what do you mean? And she said, well, their gods are not your living God. Their gods are athletes and movie stars, because the things that they would get in the newspapers that they would get were all about, things that don't matter, but politicians and athletes and movie stars. And I mean, that just, like, when I read that, I was like, whew, that is so America today. I mean, it's unbelievable the things that she went through. So then, in the spring of 1939, the Mandarin says, okay, our town is so dilapidated. I have to leave. Like, we can't stay in this Yangqing anymore. He said, I'm going to have one last feast, and I want you to come, and you're going to be the guest of honor. She had never been the guest of honor. I think she had attended some before. She took the seat of honor, and she didn't like a whole lot of praise, and so he started saying, Gladys has done this or Alway Day has done this for me, Alway Day has done that for me, she has done this, she has done this, she has done this. And she said she started to feel a little nervous, and just kind of like, all right, I don't like all the attention on me. And at the end, he said, in Alway Day, I want to serve the God that you serve. I want to become a Christian too. So when the last time she saw the Mandarin, so that was in 1939, and she got there in 1932. So it took a few years, but he ended up becoming a Christian too. So this is still not what she's known for. uh, throughout the war, she had eventually taken on 200 children, orphans, and somehow was providing for them, even as they would like go away and come back. They found out that the Japanese were coming and they were going to have to retreat, and she somehow corresponded with somebody in Free China that had an orphanage that said, "We have enough room for all of your kids if you can get them here." So she split them up and sent with the person who helped her with the inn, sent the first 100 with him. So apparently those kids made it safely, and she stayed back with the other 100. Um, he never returned, and so he was going to come back and get the next 100. He never returned. They found out later that he had been arrested. Um, so it got to the point where she found out that the Japanese thought she was a spy and had her picture on a flyer, and basically there was a ransom out, like, yeah, they would give 100, some whatever their money was at the time, dead or alive, if they found her dead or alive. So she realizes, I have to go. She didn't want to go because until then she had refused to flee. And so she realized they were coming. They literally were going to be there any day, like within the next day or two. So she had, and the place had been, like, the place was desolate. I mean, supplies were gone. She had 100 kids, and they were coming to kill her, and she knew they would kill the kids too. So she had to flee, and she found out you have to make it to the Yellow River. Apparently, this was like it took them 10 or 12 days. So she set out on foot with 100 kids and by herself. I think maybe some people were with them at some point. I'm not sure. They had enough food for 2 days. The Mandarin gave them enough food for 2 days. They ended up being gone. Oh, I think it was either 10 or 12 days. I mean, she was like terribly rough terrain, mountains. I mean, just it was cold and nowhere to sleep. I mean, they finally made it to the Yellow River, where they thought if we cross the Yellow River, we'll be over into the part where there's no fighting. Um, Miraculously, nobody died. She said it was basically the worst experience of her life. They finally get to the Yellow River, and the town was deserted because the Japanese were expected to bomb it and attack it literally any hour. Um, she ended up being there for almost 4 days when like a Chinese soldier discovered them, and it was basically like, "What are you doing here?" And she told him, and he's like, "There, all the boats are gone. I mean, there are no boats." So she basically was like, "I don't know what to do." She's at this Yellow River with 100 kids, and I mean, the Japanese are going to bomb it at any moment. And one of the little girls said, didn't God part the Red Sea so that they could walk across?" And she was just like, "They did." But Gladys was like, "Oh my gosh, I don't know what to, But she was like, they did, but and so they prayed that God would somehow part the sea. But Gladys thought, I don't even have enough. Even if He did, I wouldn't have enough energy to walk across the Yellow River. But they prayed that God would do something like He did for Moses, and part the Yellow River. But she just said this came from one of the little girls. Like her faith was encouraged by one of these little girls, a little 13-year-old girl, I think. And this was the day that Chinese soldier discovered them and said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "Okay, I can get a ferry to come over." He had a special whistle, and apparently he went like, "Durt," and all of a sudden this little ferry boat came up from the other side of the river, and came over, and they loaded the kids up. They took a third of them across, came back, loaded the kids up. Took three routes, but they made all 100 kids made it safely to the other side. And she was like, He didn't part the Yellow Sea or the Yellow River like He did the Red Sea, but God definitely made a way for us in safety, away, fleeing enemies, to make it a way. And she was like, and that was all spurned on because that little girl who she had shared the gospel with, had told her, we need to pray for this. They get to the other side, and then they have to travel 4 more days by refugee train to get close to where they're going, where the orphanage is. They find the trains finally stop. There's still fighting going on there somehow. The only way they can get across at this point even further is to ride a coal train. And they said even then that the Japanese shoot at this coal train all the time. Like, you have to ride at your own risk. So she helped with the older kids load 100 kids on top of this coal train. And they were so exhausted they just slept the whole time. They finally rode a coal train, and they finally got to the city where the orphanage was where they were trying to reach. And they had closed the gates. and they said nobody's coming in. Absolutely nobody's coming in. She was like, we've traveled like 17 days or something. I mean, through horrendous conditions. They barely had any food. They were all so tired, but it was a hard no. They would not let them go. Someone came out and said this lady who has an orphanage also has an orphanage a town over. So she finally got on one more train and made it a town over. And they said when she finally got like the last child to safety, she collapsed. And she had like four different diseases. They found out someone got her to a hospital. She was basically unconscious for 2 weeks. They said it took her almost 2 years to regain her full strength and recovery. At one point, I didn't share this. At one point during the war, when she was back there, a Japanese soldier had taken his rifle and like butted her in the head and it caused her to black out. And I think that caused some damage too, that affected her the rest of her life. So when she finally recovered, she didn't go home. She was like, I'm ready to work again. So she was in a different part. She was not Yangqing, the original little village that she had gone to. She thought that was always her, oh my gosh, it's 10:30. That was always her home. Oh my gosh, I didn't get to tell the whole story. Anyway, she stays in this new part of China. She eventually goes home really quickly to England after 17 years. She does amazing things for the Chinese people there. She ends up coming back. She always feels like China is her home. The communist government has taken over and won't allow anybody who had been a foreign citizen to come back. So she had to go to Taiwan. But a lot of her kids had finally gone to Taiwan, and so she was allowed to see them there. So basically, she went back to England for about 7 or 8 years, something like that, but moved back and spent the rest of her life in with the Chinese people. I didn't even get to tell everything because this was such an amazing story. But anyway, wow. I think she's really cool. And Noah Piper wrote a little book. She's here. This is a kid's book for her. That's where I learned a lot about her too. And then she wrote this book herself. Like it's really easy. She wasn't well educated, so it was super easy to read because it was not written on a high level. But anyway, I'm sorry that I took so long. I just got talking and I loved her story. It was really amazing. I didn't get to tell you all the crazy things. But anyway, I'll say a quick prayer. Dear Lord, thank you so much for letting us learn about Gladys Aylward today. Lord, thank you that her life was so amazing that I couldn't even talk about it in an hour. Lord, I pray that even that short story would encourage some people, Lord. Please just prepare our minds and hearts to worship you in just a few minutes, Lord. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.